Welcome everyone to this evening, and I would like to welcome you to this second or third or fourth stage of this whole enterprise of advancing human security. We've had a webinar, and then we've had several sessions of round tables with different groups. And now this is another stage where we're going to listen to a speaker, and then we're also going to listen to different groups and how they respond to where we're up to. But to begin with, I'd like to pause for a moment and acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia. We acknowledge their continuing connection to land, water, and community. And together we pay our respect to the peoples, the culture, and the elders, past and present. So thank you for coming on board for this project, for being part of this project. I'd like to introduce now our guest speaker for this evening, the Rev Tim Costello. Tim almost needs no introduction to most of the people I can see here. Tim is a Baptist minister, one of Australia's most respected community leaders, and a sought-after voice in many circles on social justice issues, leadership and ethics. For 13 years, until October 2016, Tim was the Chief Executive of World Vision Australia. Tim is the Executive Director of MICA Australia. He's also Director of Ethical Voice. As a Senior Advisor for the Centre for Public Christianity, Tim is also the Chair of the Community Council for Australia and the Co-Chair of the Charities Crisis Cabinet. He's a Chief Advocate of the Thriving Communities Partnership. And probably more well known, he's a spokesperson for the Alliance for Gambling Reform, which campaigns for law reform to prevent harm from poker machine gambling. In his spare time, he has had the time to publish a number of books on spirituality and life, faith and life. I'd like to welcome Tim on your behalf. Welcome, Tim. Where are you?
I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
I can see you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. It's a delight to be with you. And this topic of human security has never been more fraught, more necessary, more urgent. And thank you for giving your time to turn your mind to it. I never take for granted the fact that people give up their time. The only thing we have in life really is time. It's why when someone wastes your time, they're a thief. You never get that time back. So to choose to invest your time with morally serious subjects like human security is commendable, and I thank you for doing it. So I want to reflect on the situation we're in with human security, and it was never more dramatically illustrated than on the 23rd of September this year, when our Foreign Minister, along with the leaders of 9 other countries at the United Nations, declared a declaration of protection for humanitarian personnel. Humanitarian personnel are the front line of emergency response, humanitarian relief, development work in our very broken world. And this declaration was made because there has never been a more dangerous time for humanitarian workers and humanitarian personnel. 2023 was the highest number of humanitarian personnel who died. 280, hundreds more injured and wounded. 2024 is going to far surpass that number of 280. Gaza alone, 300 humanitarian workers have died. And that's before we get to Sudan and South Sudan and Ukraine and other places. I might say that in addition to humanitarian personnel, many journalists have died. And the two, journalists and humanitarian workers, do go hand in hand. It is absolutely a Siamese twin relationship. To get out the need for humanitarian work to be supported, you need journalists telling the story and interviewing humanitarian personnel. And the atrocious loss of life of journalists, the most dangerous years again for them, is equally devastating. So this declaration was made on the 23rd of September. The other nations joining Australia included the United Kingdom and Switzerland and Brazil and Jordan and a number of others. And it really was a watershed moment to actually have a declaration that reminded the world and the United Nations of what had always been accepted principles when it comes to human security. Those really are four principles. They're the foundations of human security: humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. Humanity, that really is something that until recently, including this declaration in September, we just took for granted. Whether it is the universal human rights, that all humans carry rights and dignity and rights are indivisible. A breach somewhere is a breach to all of us in our human rights. Whether it's framed in faith terms, different faiths frame it differently. My own faith, Christianity, that all humans, irrespective of color, ethnicity, disability, sexuality, poverty, economic status, carry the image of God and therefore are inviolable. However it's framed, that humanity is under attack. We know the world is profoundly re-tribalizing. We know that for 10,000 plus years, humans have sought human security in terms of tribe. And there was great fear of the other tribes, often violence, war. The profound boundaries between tribes was seen as the way for human security to be provided. To actually say we're not going to have freeloaders in this tribe because they will burden us, and therefore tight boundaries to exclude them, and a sense of utter loyalty to the tribe and defending it. The Universal Human Rights Declarations and Principles of Humanity, the first pillar of human security, sought to rise above tribalism, to actually establish it on universal principles of all humans. What we're seeing with re-tribalizing, and we know for 10,000 years humans sought their security this way, but it meant fear and defensiveness and war and attacks. We are starting to see that again. I don't need to remind you, in the past election campaign in the US, the now the now presumptive president, the president-elect, used phrases of people, immigrants, poisoning the blood supply, the enemy within, the phrases of literally questioning the humanity of political opponents. We have seen that sort of language resonating in many other contexts with ethno-authoritarian leaders. And it is the expression of tribalization that undermines human security, that transcends tribe, that is based upon universal, inviolable principles of all humans. So that first pillar of humanity is certainly under assault. It is now being contested with very dominant narratives of fear of the other, demonization of immigrants, of refugees, questioning profoundly their humanity. And if soon-to-be President Trump acts on his promise to deport 11 million plus undocumented people in America, you can only deport that many with massive deportation camps, effectively concentration camps. What does that say about these people's humanity, their rights, or now lack of rights? So the first principle of humanity is profoundly under attack. The second principle of impartiality. I remember having a conversation in 2013 with President Putin in his Dasha before he had invaded Crimea. I was part of civil society with the G20. We were pressing on him why he was using the Foreign Agents Law to crack down on Russian charities. His answer was, well, if they take a volunteer or a dollar from outside of Russia, they're not impartial. I had been briefed well by Russian charities. I said to him in this hour-long meeting, no, you have one word in Russian for two words in English. Your one word in Russian is politics. The two words in English are policy and politics. When NGOs and charities criticize policy, they are not breaching impartiality and being political. You have confused these two words. Their right to operate is on the basis of impartiality, and civil society will criticize policy. It doesn't mean it has breached impartiality and has become a partisan political player. In that conversation, and Putin had the TV cameras and the press in through the whole time, so confident was he. I saw myself on TV in Moscow that night and read my comments in the English-speaking Moscow Times, widely reported. Putin made the concession that he would ask the Duma to repeal the Russian Foreign Agents Law, beating up Russian charities because they weren't impartial in his view. I was a hero for 12 months in Russian civil society because everyone saw Putin's promise. I saw Putin at the 2014 G20 in Brisbane. Tony Abbott was Prime Minister. Remember, Tony Abbott was going to shirt front Putin for MH17 at that gathering. I said to Putin, why didn't you keep your promise? Repeal the Foreign Agents Law. We thought we had convinced you about civil society's impartiality. Putin, well, if you can ever say Putin looks a bit embarrassed, Putin looked a bit embarrassed. He said, I asked the Duma, and the Duma wouldn't agree, the Russian parliament. Well, we all know who controls the Duma. The first pillar, humanity under attack, impartiality under attack, neutrality. Neutrality is the third pillar for human security and for the operations of humanitarian personnel. Really, it means that the symbols that we actually show and declare and live out in practice aren't aligned with particular militias or factions or flying particular flags. We all know what happened to the World Food Kitchen, particularly to Zumi and the Australian worker in delivering aid in Gaza, displaying clear signs, having given the Israeli military clear communications of the coordinates going into Gaza and delivering aid, and they were targeted by drones. And Zumi, an Australian humanitarian aid worker, and 7 of her colleagues lost her life. It led to Penny Wong insisting on an investigation. The investigation basically saw the military in Israel say it was a mistake. Those mistakes should not and ever happen. I found that completely unacceptable. Again, a breach of the neutrality principle and foundation. The final foundation is independence. Based on universal human rights and humanitarian law, the independence of humanitarian workers to respond to need, wherever it is, whatever the causes of the conflict or disaster. We are seeing independence being profoundly undermined. We know when it comes to the media, no media, independent media have been allowed in Gaza. The journalists that were there, so many have lost their lives. The independence to act without fear or favour, to respond to human need, because that is the calling, that is the obligation, and that is what being humanitarian to address the needs of human security absolutely means. That too is being lost. Right now, aid organisations in Australia are fleshing out with DFAT the content of this 23rd of September declaration for the protection of humanitarian personnel. And the content that they're actually suggesting to the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, is real accountability. In my time in World Vision, I lost 13 staff, humanitarian staff. I can say there was no accountability or justice for the families. They included staff in Afghanistan, staff in Pakistan, staff in Indonesia. More recently, Oxfam have lost staff in Gaza, Caritas staff in Congo. The lack of any accountability and justice is what is being fleshed out to make these principles actually have meat. The second thing about that accountability with real sanctions is we need far more than 10 nations to sign up to this declaration. It really needs to be the nations of the world signing up. Otherwise, there will be huge black spots of accountability. Fleshing out the declaration, in DFAT, we are recommending resources. We are recommending proper resources for this declaration to be enforced and for action where there is breaches and a lack of accountability to be taken. We are recommending and fleshing out advocacy and education of countries where we work in humanitarian disasters and conflict to be aware that the United Nations has this declaration and they must take it seriously and be aware of it and will be held accountable if they aren't. Well, I think my time might have finished, but I really thank you again for taking human security seriously. From the optimism of my time in leading World Vision, where we, under the Millennium Development Goals, made huge progress in lifting millions out of poverty, where we had wonderful advocacy movements make poverty history. We are certainly seeing human security threatened. I now lead Micah Australia, and Micah Australia, which does advocacy for the faith-based international organisations in Australia, has devised a 3-year campaign called A Safer World for All. ACFID, the Australian Council for International Development, and all the agencies that are part of it have now joined this campaign as the campaign for international development, A Safer World for All. We have chosen that title, A Safer World, because human security is being profoundly undermined. The lobbying that has begun on both sides of politics around safety, which includes climate change safety, it includes forgiving debt of massively indebted countries who are spending 60-70% of their budget on interest repayments, not education, not health. But it specifically focuses on increasing Australian aid to 1% of budget. We often talked in terms of a percentage of gross national income, and the recommended rich country standard was 0.7% of gross national income. Australia has slipped to 0.19% of gross national income. But fractional percentage points are just too confusing. It's very hard to campaign on them. No one can ever remember a fraction of GNI, even though Scandinavian and Dutch and other societies have kept their promise of 0.7%. Australia is 0.19%. Australia has slipped from the Abbott years when $1 billion was cut out of aid to 28th out of 31 OECD countries in generosity. We are in the bottom 3 of generous OECD countries now. Aid, which was at 0.5% under Bob Menzies and was bipartisan, has slipped to 0.19% of gross national income. So what we're asking is a simple ask, and we're getting some bipartisan take up for Safer World for All of 1% of budget. 1% of budget will amount to an increase of about $2 billion. It will get us up around 0.3% of gross national income. It still doesn't get us past the midway mark of generosity in OECD countries. But 1% of budget is a figure that's sharper, clearer, and when we've tested it with coalition MPs federally, they have said, well, yes, I guess that's fair for a safer world for all, as has Penny Wong, Pat Conroy, and those on the Labor side. So for the next 3 years, you'll see a campaign, A Safer World for All. And that campaign by all the ACFID members that Micah Australia that I lead came up with really comes out of what we're talking about tonight. The loss of human security, the loss of safety. So that is a practical thing. We'd invite you to sign up for the Safer World for All campaign and to be a voice, to write to your MPs, to advocate as an expression of this tonight's meeting on human security. So I've probably gone over time, but let me finish there.
Thank you, Tim, for those words of outlining a lot of your vast experience, as well as opening up the whole meaning of human security for us in the way that you have. I ask you if you would like to stay, because we're going to listen to a few people who represent different organisations and different facets of human security, and you might like to take part in the conversation later as we hear those people. Can I just say that we're not going to have a Q&A as part of this, but if issues come up for you or questions, could I ask you to put them into the chat, and then we'll deal with those at a later stage. So I hand over to you now, Joe, and I will mute myself.
Thank you very much, Katrina. And of course, thank you to Tim for that splendid introduction. We are now, as Katrina was saying, we are going to hear from a number of groups and organizations that have a very strong, indeed, I would say, passionate interest in different aspects of human security. Some of them have already participated in some of the initiatives we've been engaged in since the beginning of this year, including 2 roundtables, which in April and May of this year, which brought some 40 organizations together. But we thought at this particular meeting, we would have the opportunity to probe a little more deeply into not just how various groups view security, human security, human safety, but also how they think their particular commitments and programs and priorities relate to human security. So I'm now going to call on 10 organizations, one after the other. We've suggested they speak for about 3 to 4 minutes each, which hopefully we are able to then to keep more or less on time, followed by what I think will be quite a lively conversation. So the first one that I propose to call on is the Medical Association for the Prevention of War. It is a national association of health professionals who are working for health by working for peace, formed in 1981. Medical Association for the Prevention of War, MAPW, is an affiliate of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, and they were awarded the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize. And we're very fortunate to have with us the president of MAPW, Dr. Sue Wareham, who's well known to many, a retired general practitioner and endless advocate of peace and related matters, as we shall hear. So over to you, Sue.
Is that better?
That is good.
Okay. Okay. Can everybody hear all right?
I can.
Good. Thank you. Right. Thanks for that, Joe. And thank you very much, Tim, for that very, very moving introduction to our situation. I'm going to move right along. I haven't timed this. I'm sorry. So please give me a warning if it's too much. And there's so much to cover in this. So what I'm going to say is, I'm going to say initially that for human security, we need to preserve a future by urgently addressing the 2 greatest threats to civilization as we know it, and that's nuclear weapons and climate change, one of which could end much of the life on this planet very quickly, nuclear weapons, of course, and the other one, climate change, is doing it more slowly. Unless we get rid of nuclear weapons, they'll be used again. The consequences will be catastrophic. And with climate change, we know that it's a reality right now. While we need to get rid of nuclear weapons, I'm going to say also that our obligation goes much further than that. Modern warfare itself threatens human security on a mass scale. It's through not only nuclear weapons, but artificial intelligence, aerial bombardment, starving, deprivation, and other horrors of the sort that we're seeing in Gaza right now. The key principle that I think we recognise here that's relevant now is that people and nations, and I'm going to repeat pretty much what Tim has said, we need to work together, we need to rediscover our common humanity and the need to face these and other great challenges together. The prevailing sense of competition that there is in the world and even dehumanizing is bringing us closer to apocalyptic conditions, which is pretty much what the people in Gaza are suffering right now. I'm just going to mention that the power of a good example is huge. And while there's an obligation on all nations to act to address these challenges, the obligation is greatest for the nations that have contributed the most, that have the greatest resources and the most power. That's the first part. Joe, you asked us also to address proposals and practical initiatives. So you'd like me to do that now? Okay, yeah. All right. So proposals and practical initiatives, where do we choose? Where do we start in the Australian context? There's just so much. I'm going to name 4 things. And first one, again, is pretty much in line with what Tim was saying, which is that human security demands that we regard all lives as equal and equally worthy of protection, no matter where people live, whether they live in Australia, Ukraine, Palestine, Sudan, or anywhere else. Therefore, Australia's responses to attacks on innocent people must apply the same rules for all, which is not what is happening now. And Australia must enforce international humanitarian law consistently, which is not what's happening now. That's the first one. Second one is that Australia should our government should declare that Australia will not take part in any US war against China. The concept of such a war is so dangerous that it should be unthinkable. And to help to promote this, we need to undermine the appalling AUKUS deal through every means that we have available, particularly with an election coming up next year. Third thing I'm going to say is that we need to rein in the arms trade. Because the nations that profit from war have no interest in peace. Particularly, MAPW is looking at the role of the arms trade in getting access to students through STEM programs in schools. We need to get vested interests out of our schools. And the fourth initiative I'm going to mention is actually not a new one, but it's not going to go away until it's implemented. And it's great to see Melissa Park here. Australia must sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This would be an absolutely huge game changer in global thinking about nuclear weapons and the threat that they pose to human security for all of us. There's more, but I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Joe.
Thank you very much, Sue. Well, now I'd like to move to, if I may, the Catholic, just give me a minute. I'm trying to see whether I'm sticking to my order. The Catholic Social Services Victoria, which is the peak body for Catholic social services across the state, some 40 plus member organizations to assist the Catholic Church with and serve the poor, the disadvantaged, and the marginalized. And it's a great pleasure to have with us the Executive Director of Catholic Social Services Victoria, Joshua Lawrence. So over to you, Josh. Now, maybe he's not here. I'm going down the list of because I can't see everyone on the screen at the same time. I can't see him, so we'll just move on, and I will instead proceed to the next one on my list, which is the Islamic Council of Victoria, which is the peak Muslim body in Victoria, representing an estimated 250,000 Muslims, give or take. It has 76 member societies, representing some 100 diverse ethnic communities in the state of Victoria. And we have with us Mohammed Mohideen, who was the previous president of the ICV and is currently its vice president. Over to you, Mohammed.
Thanks a lot, Joe, and good evening, everyone. From an Islamic point of view, there are a few things we discuss with human security. Safeguarding the religion, the soul, the progeny, and the mind. And when we discuss in these two aspects of it, we always adhere to the Quran and the Sunnah, which are books that we are guided by. For us as Muslims, we look at that we are created to worship God with a duty to help and build this earth. And we look at security as linguistically meaning tranquility, which opposes fear. So it is the tranquility of the soul and the elimination of fear that Islam considers security, immune from any threat. So keeping this in mind, I'm just going to touch on just two aspects of it. As such, the importance to be able to freely practice your faith without harm or discrimination, to live a righteous life is the fundamental right of all Muslims and non-Muslims. Yes, there's legislation available, but in reality, these legislations can be a bone of contention between people of faith and no faith. The visibility of the community by their dress code, especially for Muslims or practices, has led to many cases of assault and trauma. More than physical harm, the psychological harm and being told that you don't belong and your faith is the cause of evil doesn't really help with the young and vulnerable. It questions the very identity of being Australian. Unlike the Jewish and the Sikh community, where racial vilification laws can be applied, Muslims are not a race, but people who adhere to the Islamic faith. Also, the state government enacts laws of anti-terrorism, which have been basically targeted against Muslims, and it does not help. These legislations have been harmful than supportive. The term religiously motivated ideology, there's a sense of them versus us, and is not helping to grow children to feel a sense of persecution. Post-September 11, this has become a big issue. The term Islamic terrorist is so offensive to Muslims. It's only the Islamic faith that is used in this connotation with terrorism. So keeping this in mind, I think, is a big issue for us. It also questions the loyalty of a young Muslim to the country and his people. So this is one of the biggest issues when we talk about human security. And for ICV and the Muslims, I'm looking at the second question that Joe sent me. For ICV and Muslims, one is engaging and educating our community of identifying Islamophobia and what it means, how we mean to address this issue. Muslims are generally very resilient and do not like to be classed as victims. Due to this resilient nature, there is such underreporting of incidents of Islamophobia. It is important to understand Muslims know best about Islamophobia, and if we want to tackle it, we need to work with them very closely. The second is financial security and acceptance in the employment sector, especially our youth. Today, there are many forms of subtle discrimination that exist in society, especially when they apply for jobs. If they were to apply with a Muslim name, you can be sure they might not be called for an interview. But the moment they anglicize their names, it changes. So we know that financial security is important for human security. And how do we address this and make it acceptable so that future generations of Muslims are not discriminated in this sense? Thank you. Thanks, Joe. You're muted.
Are you there, Joe?
He's muted.
I was there, but muted. Apologies. Thank you, Mohammed. I was just saying thank you for raising those issues, and I'm sure that we will return to them perhaps in the conversation in a little while. Well, let me now move on to our next organization, which is with us this evening. I hope they're with us this evening, and that I'm sure they are. ICANN Australia. For those, most of you I think will know that ICANN is a coalition of NGOs now in some 100, perhaps more than 100 countries, promoting adherence to and implementation of the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It was established in Melbourne in 2006, and some 10 or so years later, 2017 to be precise, it won the Nobel Peace Prize. And we're delighted to have with us Melissa Pax, who is the executive director and was a former UN legal expert and a federal government minister. So Melissa, we're delighted to have you with us and look forward to hearing from you.
Right, just make sure I've got my, yes, I have got my sound on. Hi, everybody. It's
Hello.
wonderful, wonderful to see you all. And I know there are a number of friends in the room. Can I thank the previous speakers, including Sue, who mentioned some of the issues that I will raise, and of course, Tim. Thank you for your moving words. As someone who used to work in Gaza with UNRWA, and I've lost a number of former colleagues and friends, I feel this project to protect humanitarian workers and journalists is so important. So also, can I thank and applaud those of you involved in the Human Security Project? The need for a paradigm shift from military security to human security has never been clearer or more urgent. Every day we're witnessing the killing and maiming of civilians in Palestine, Lebanon, Ukraine, Sudan, and elsewhere on a massive scale. And amid this carnage, global military expenditure is skyrocketing, and relations among so-called great powers of the world are deteriorating further and further. Meanwhile, the environment is in crisis and social inequality is rising steeply. It's a truly dire state of affairs, but we have to persevere. For ICANN, human security has always been central to our work. And can I just say that tonight I'm not representing ICANN Australia, but ICANN International, of which ICANN Australia is a part. And I'm coming to you from chilly Geneva. Unless we eliminate nuclear weapons from the world and address other global challenges, including the environment crisis, true peace and security will remain elusive. In the UN Secretary-General's new Agenda for Peace, the #1 recommendation is the elimination of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons threaten our existence at every moment. Today, there are around 12,000 nuclear weapons globally, and more than $90 billion is squandered every year enhancing and expanding nuclear arsenals. Just think what of the sustainable development goals we could achieve with that kind of funding. As Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary General, said in 2022, nuclear weapons are the most destructive power ever created. They offer no security, just carnage and chaos. Their elimination would be the greatest gift we could bestow on future generations. Approaching nuclear weapons from a human security perspective means ensuring that humanitarian considerations are at the centre of the debate. It means listening to and heeding the warnings of those harmed by nuclear weapons, whether in Hiroshima or Nagasaki, or test sites around the world, including in Australia and the Pacific. It means treating every nuclear weapon as a grave and unacceptable threat, regardless of which country possesses it. And it means adopting abolition as a goal, not merely non-proliferation or arms control. This is how I believe we should define a human security approach to nuclear weapons. ICANN's specific proposal for Australia is very simple. Sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and then faithfully implement it. There is very widespread public support across the nation, including from organisations like the Australian Red Cross, the Australian Medical Association, the Australian Conservation Foundation, and the Australian Council of Trade Unions, and the Australian Local Government Association. since cities are the primary targets of nuclear weapons. 109 current federal parliamentarians have pledged their support, including the Prime Minister and a majority of cabinet members. And it's a long-standing policy position of the Labor Party in Australia to sign and ratify the TPNW in government. And now is the time for them to act on that commitment. With Indonesia and the Solomon Islands ratification of the TPNW in September, Australia is now almost completely surrounded by TPNW states parties, and we are out of step with our own region. 7 ASEAN members have ratified the treaty and 11 Pacific states have done so, including New Zealand, which has been among the treaty's most vocal proponents. We should welcome and celebrate their adherence to the TPNW as it enhances everyone's security, including ours. For Australia, joining the TPNW would mean extricating ourselves from the US nuclear warfighting apparatus and dispensing with the dangerous fallacy of extended nuclear deterrence. The fact of the matter is Australia is not protected by a nuclear umbrella and never has been. Nuclear weapons don't protect anyone, not the citizens of the countries that possess them, not those of us in allied states. All nuclear weapons can do is destroy. And the TPNW can provide us with true protection in the form of an anti-nuclear umbrella. The treaty is the first international agreement to provide for victim assistance and environmental remediation for communities impacted by nuclear weapons use and testing. For Australia, joining the treaty would also mean doing more to assist communities harmed by nuclear testing at Maralinga, Emu Field, and the Montebello Islands. As our government has acknowledged, it is First Nations peoples who have suffered the most from these toxic, deadly experiments in mass destruction. The TPNW is not simply a disarmament treaty, it is also an environment treaty, a human rights treaty, and a treaty for nuclear justice. I look forward to the day when Australia joins the treaty, and ICANN is committed to working with its many partners across the country to make that day a reality. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Melissa. Are you there, Joe?
I am. I've done the naughty thing again. I was kept muted, but now I think you can hear me. I was thanking Melissa for raising this issue of security, namely security from the nuclear threat, which is a challenge for Australia as it is for the world as a whole. And now we move on to yet another organization with a different but not totally unrelated by any means set of interests, and that is the Brigidine Asylum Seekers Project. It is a project that's been going since for over 20 years, works for a humane, just and inclusive approach for people seeking asylum in Australia, and a project that has provided invaluable services to a great number of people in need who would have otherwise been neglected. And it's a privilege to invite Bridget Arthur, who's the co-founder and a project coordinator for BASP, Brigidine Asylum Seekers Project. So, Bridget, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Joe. Obviously, displacement of people around the world is a reality, and this sort of has been touched on by the other speakers. What we need, of course, are the things that they're talking about. Being certain that there isn't nuclear weapons being used, that we are addressing climate change, etc. But in the meantime, it is a reality that people are moving in large numbers, not necessarily out of their own country, but being displaced in their own country, and more normally just over the borders, and to a certain extent further afield, like places like Australia. I mean, our the principle that's underlying a lot of what we would be trying to do, and many, many other people, is based on that all people are equal, all people are precious, and none more precious than another, and all people should be treated justly. All people should be able to stay in their own homes. But while that is not true, then we have to try and do something to make it possible for people to move to safety. It seems to me that, and many others will say this, that Australia is doing exactly the opposite. And so we have to work on trying to get our government to be much more decent, to stop being punitive to people who move here seeking protection, to try and give them a decent life when they arrive here. Other countries are doing this, not in huge numbers, but some other countries are. Scotland and Switzerland and some other countries, Germany did, but increasingly across the world, the far-right forces politically are making it very difficult for people to move and be looked after. And indeed, Australia is copied. The worst of our policies are copied in other countries. So I guess what we would be trying to achieve, many other people like our organisation, is to make certain that Australia could be copied, but copied for the right reasons. And we talk about regularising the situation for people when they first arrive, like treating them like people who are going to be citizens here, looking after them, welcoming them, changing the narrative about their very existence, not talking about them as a threat. And I was just looking at one of the posters put out by the Australian government. I can't believe it, actually. And the poster is just so sort of fear-mongering that, it rests on a set of principles that says these people are dangerous and we should be very, very careful about letting them in. So looking for a positive response, and particularly that narrative, because I think the policies and practices that we engage in rest on actually a narrative that we have in this country. So when we're trying to get people to think about change, we talk about just thinking kindly, at least, about these people who are arriving here, and not demonising them in any way. I'll stop there, Joe.
Thank you very much, Bridget, and we look forward to your participation in the conversation in a little while. Okay, well now, the next one we're going to move to is somewhat of a different kind of organisation, but much to contribute, and I'm referring to Pearls and Irritations. Some of you may have heard of it. I'm sure many of you have. Pearls and Irritations has been going as a platform for the dissemination of ideas from a progressive point of view, and also commentary, which is perhaps a little more incisive than what we have come to be used to in our mainstream news media. It deals with issues of politics generally, public policy, foreign defense policy, economy, media, arts, and religion. And we have with us this evening Dr. Aaron Martin, who's the editor, who has a background in international relations with a focus on international security, conflict prevention, peace building, and dialogue, intercultural dialogue. So, Aaron, over to you.
Thank you very much, Joe. And can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Right, and that's correct. So I'm the editor of Pearls and Irritations, and I'm also the director of an organisation called the Global Security Foundation, of which human security is certainly a core part of that organisation too. So within Pearls and Irritations, look, human security certainly animates our work and the work of our authors, many of which are in the room with us tonight. on the Zoom room at least. And so primarily it does that as a tool to challenge the shallow, but often dominant narratives of security driven by military security and national security that we see both in media, by which I mean mainstream media, but also in terms of government discourses, in terms of think tank discourses in particular, and increasingly into our universities. So for us, the human security framework, I think, brings back into the discussion the question of who security is for in ways that those much shallower security narratives often miss. And it's very useful for us to question when, for instance, intelligence agencies, governments, or commentators make claims such as that a particular policy advances security or that something is a risk to security. And I'd point particularly to policies such as the AUKUS submarine deal, which has as its reference point a risk from the rise of China and a claim that this military purchase will in some way increase Australia's security. And as soon as we put that into a human security lens, I think we can sort of challenge those claims very usefully. So we can challenge whether, for instance, China itself is a threat. Is it a threat towards Australia's economy as our biggest trade partner? Probably not. Is it a threat to people's experience of the environment? Well, potentially through the sale of Australian coal to China, but through the sale of electric vehicles and through lowering the costs of Australia's renewable energy transition, I think under a human security framework, it would be very hard to make that sort of case. So certainly in our work, using that framework to sort of challenge that very shallow, simplistic national security, military security framework is very useful in our work. Now, the second question is about some sort of recommendations about what we would like to see happen. And so in the media more generally, we would certainly like to see those type of who questions around security asked by journalists much more than they are now. We'd like them asked across a sort of a range of policies. So we're not just talking about sort of foreign policy. And the second one is really when we think about sort of government policy and government frameworks, we have some frameworks such as the measuring what matters framework within government, which is starting to move towards a different view of policy and how we measure policy. And we also have embedded frameworks within government such as national security tests on certain policies around agreements we make or all sorts of policies. And I think certainly it would be wonderful to think in terms of introducing a human security test to both government policy, but also in media discourse. And that wouldn't be just in terms of foreign policy, but also looking at things like youth crime and tough on youth crime policies across the field. We certainly think that that would be a very interesting concept to pursue. So thank you very much, Joe, and back to you.
Are you there, Joe?
To Katrina, third time lucky. I can't risk it one more time. But anyhow, I was thanking Aaron for raising a set of questions which goes to the role of media, which is obviously crucial because that's one of the main avenues that we have for people making some sense of the world in which we live, including, of course, what is happening in this country. So it was important to have a perspective on what that media role might look like. Now, our next organization that we have invited is the Australian Palestine Advocacy Network. We've invited them for the obvious reason. They participated in one of the roundtables, but we thought we'd invite them this evening for the obvious reason that what is happening in Palestine, in the Middle East more generally, is now of such a crucial issue, which of course is impacting on Australia itself in so many different ways. For those who may not know, the Australia Palestine Advocacy Network deals with human rights, the human rights of the Palestinian community, both in Palestine and internationally, the many millions of Palestinian refugees. It involves human rights groups, religious groups, aid and development agencies, unions, and others. And generally, it is an advocacy coalition in support of Palestinian human rights, justice, and equality. And now, unfortunately, Nasser Mashni, who is the president of APAN, Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network, and is himself the son of a Palestinian refugee and co-founder of Australians for Palestine, let me know that APAN is moving towards a major national conference in a week or so, and has a board meeting in preparation for it, which overlaps with our meeting this evening. So very kindly, he prepared a short video presentation, which I'm going to try and share with you. So please understand the limits of my technical skill as I try and do that. When I bring it to the screen, I will let it run for a few seconds, and then I'll pause it and try and make sure that you can in fact see it and hear it. Otherwise, it will be mission not accomplished. So let me try. Yes. Now, can you see the screen?
Yes, you can see it, Joe.
Yes.
Yes,
All
you
right,
can.
we'll now play it and see what happens.
No sound.
No sound.
No.
Okay. Can you hear anything?
No.
Something is not working.
You've just gone past the sound thing. The sound is...
It's on full. So
When you go to share screen, Joe, before you start it, you have to activate the video thing. Does that make sense?
Activated before I started.
yeah.
Yes. So before you start sharing screen, there'll be a little thing says video or something.
What Joe's trying to do.
You have to activate that.
I think perhaps you mean activate audio.
Yeah, that's right.
So when you
all these people are trying to tell him how to do it, and they come up on the screen.
Now, when I try and share screen, you are telling me I should do what?
Before you share screen.
Oh, share sound.
Yeah, get it going before you.
I'm sorry.
And demand
Can you hear now?
Thank you for the opportunity to share the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network's
Can you hear reasonably well?
Human security.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you for the opportunity to share the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network's perspective on human security. We believe that real human security means dignity, justice, and equality for all, especially for those enduring genocidal violence and occupation like the Palestinian people. This isn't just about aid, it's about confronting oppression and supporting the right to resist. For Palestinians, achieving human security necessitates dismantling the prolonged Israeli colonial occupation, systematic apartheid, and genocidal violence. It requires that we all reject the creeping normalization and globalization of oppression and demand accountability for violations of international law. Several elements of APAN's work are relevant to the envisioning of an Australian Human Security Charter. When we think of human security, we think about the necessity of boldly embracing non-military measures to uproot injustice. The Palestinian-led boycott, divestment and sanctions BDS movement, inspired by the South African anti-apartheid struggle, exemplifies this call to action. It invites us all to unite against injustice by applying pressure on Israel until it ends the occupation, grants equal rights to Palestinians, and recognises and allows for the inalienable right of Palestinians to return to their homes. At the heart of APAN's mission is amplifying Palestinian voices and empowering communities. We believe those impacted by oppression and injustice must be free to shape their futures. Their stories, skills and aspirations are essential. A human security charter must place marginalised people at the forefront, enabling them to drive policy making and craft solutions that resonate within their realities. Finally, we advocate for an evidence-based approach to anti-racism that dismantles the systematic oppression, with First Nations justice illuminating the path to equity. These principles are vital for a human security vision that defends justice, resists genocide, and embraces freedom for all, weaving a tapestry of liberation that uplifts every voice, including that of the resilient Palestinian people. And finally, a thank you to you, Professor Camilleri, for your leadership in this essential endeavour, and to all those participating in and working on this project. Thank you all. Thank you for
Who we got now?
Okay, well, sorry that the sound quality was not as good as we would have wished, but that's the best I could do in the circumstances. So, but you'll all be getting the recording in due course, and that will
whatever that was.
And that will make
Facebook
much more audible than it was.
6-digit number.
Okay, so, please no sound from wherever you happen to be, anyone participating, because we can hear everything.
Barry Squire is making a noise.
Yes, I understand. Okay. Well, now we can move on to our next organization. We thank Nasser in his absence, and no doubt we can catch up with him again and other members of APAN at a later date. Now I would like to call on the Doctors Reform Society, established some 50 years ago, an organization of doctors and medical students promoting measures to improve health for all in a socially just and equitable way. And to represent the Doctors Reform Society is Dr. Tim Woodruff, who's the president. He's a specialist physician working in private rheumatology practice. So, Tim, it's a pleasure to invite you to address us.
Thank you, Joe. About a year ago, I was knocked off of the president's position. I'm just a vice president now.
Okay.
Don't worry. We're bringing it back to Australia, to individual Australians, because that's what the work that we do is. Most of the speakers so far have been talking about the huge picture, and that's fantastic. For us, affordable access to timely and culturally appropriate health services for everybody is essential, as is the ability to make optimum use of that access, which requires addressing the social determinants of health, the conditions in which we live, work, and play. One without the other embeds insecurity. Indeed, a sense of control over one's life and those around is perhaps another way of saying human security, at least for the individual. Our focus has been Australia, but we recognise these principles as applicable worldwide. We see the principles as basic human rights. People who are sick and cannot afford or cannot access appropriate health care feel insecure. Fixing that issue is not that hard in a rich country like ours if there is the political will. In Australia, that does not currently exist. In the Whitlam era, there were visionaries who believed in equitable access. There are few such people now in positions of political power. But providing that access and affordability is just the first step in ensuring a feeling of security, a feeling of control over one's life. Countries which have much more equitable access to healthcare than we do, we actually rate 9th out of 10 OECD countries in terms of access. But people who are in those countries where there's good access don't necessarily have good health outcomes. They aren't as secure as one might hope. The reason? It's the social determinants of health, the conditions in which we live, work and play, beautifully illustrated in a study of English public servants in the 1980s. Despite a job and equitable access through the NHS, mortality and morbidity from almost every cause followed a gradient. At the top, people felt in control, secure, well able to make the best use of the access and advice they were given from the NHS. At the bottom, on a basic wage, but definitely a wage, people felt insecure, not able to make the best use of what was available. And in the middle income earners, they were in the middle with health outcomes and the sense of control. It's a gradient. Providing the sense of control over one's life, that security requires addressing poverty, educational opportunities, secure housing, protection from violence, effects of climate change, and the many other social factors which impact different people's lives. And when we talk about poverty, it is important that we look at the evidence that in richer countries, not in poor countries, but in richer countries, it is not absolute poverty necessarily, it's relative poverty that counts. Thus, an English public servant in the 1980s would not be seen as poor, got a full-time job. But perceptions count when one is talking about security and control over one's life. The rich can do anything. The relatively poor, base grade public servants cannot. They know it, they feel it, and they suffer, especially in a society with marked inequality. What we'd like to see is a commitment from our policymakers to formally recognise, one, that there is that access to adequate healthcare is a basic human right. We'd also like to see a commitment to equity, i.e. the opportunity for everyone to achieve their optimum capacity in life without impinging on others' opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tim. We've gone, I'm glad you've raised all those questions and taken us from the global to the domestic, and the two, of course, we know are closely connected. Sticking with the domestic for a moment longer, I think Josh Lawrence is now with us. And Josh, I think you weren't here a little earlier, and I did introduce you thinking you were amongst us, but assuming I'm right in thinking you are with us now, I've introduced the Catholic Social Services Victoria as a peak body for Catholic social services. And I did mention, but remind everyone, that you are the Executive Director of Catholic Social Services. And we're delighted that you are with us and invite you to take the floor.
Oh, thanks very much, John. I sincerely apologise to the group for not being here when I was called on before. Some family things were going on in the background. But yeah, so as Joe mentioned, Catholic Social Services Victoria is the peak body for 40 or so Catholic organisations working in every aspect of service and in a large way, many community building programs and projects. And I guess in considering the questions that were put to us tonight on human security as a frame and what do we sort of bring to the table and what's our lens when it comes to this, and it probably comes really about it comes from probably our base in Catholic social teachings, which is probably the one that really resonates with a framework of human security is a politics of the common good. So when we go about thinking through what are we seeing in Victoria, our members touch the lives of about 300,000 Victorians every year, and who are all experiencing some kind of insecurity. So I guess the security language I've avoided, but I think in an earlier meeting of this project, it really made me think, yeah, we can reclaim this word security because it is the base of so many good social relationships. And so for us, when we're in the work that our members are doing, our member organisations, and in thinking through where are we best placed to contribute in the project of building up a politics for the common good, we have back in Victoria, and this could be probably applied across the country of Australia, but homelessness is of serious concern, and it is increasing. Now, it's not increasing too much in terms of percentage of the population, but it is increasing because our population is increasing. And so we have this kind of, and of course, the services and communities that are trying to support people who are homeless, the funding remains similar, the contributions remain similar. So we're seeing a scale of need, we're seeing more people turned away. And of course, this contributes to a really, having a place to live is foundational to positive human relationships and human flourishing. And indeed, I'd argue, a politics for the common good and human security more broadly. I think if we look at I think when we've been looking at homelessness across the state of Victoria, we've seen the peri-urban around Melbourne. So the peri-urban areas are starting to see homelessness in new ways, and also regional areas, regional centres. So these are some things that we're considering in light of this broader understanding of what's going to base us for good, healthy relationships between us all, and be a grounding that brings the best out of people. Well, it's a home to live in that's safe and secure and affordable. So that homelessness is sort of a way I think our member organisations, and certainly Catholic Social Services Victoria, seriously considers as both a social policy, a personal response, and a way of being in community with each other is extremely important. The other one is, I think, which goes to the heart of human security. I think a number of our members run women's refuges. They work with families where violence is used and perpetrated within them. The very place where we hope to see people thrive and prosper. We've seen in Australia ever since the Royal Commission in 2016 in Victoria here, as people have become perhaps more cognizant of what domestic and family violence looks like. We've seen this reported, billions of dollars invested in response, and yet our services report this year the complexity, the danger that people are working with, the tragic end of domestic and family violence, very present in our communities. So when we come to approach again human security as a whole, it really is coming to the crux of why is it that we're seeing in the spaces where we want to see families flourish, we're seeing violence being used. And I think all the evidence that we have to suggest that's been going on in a deep way, and we see our ballpark, while our members serve everyone. Yes, we're Catholic Social Services, but we serve everyone across the community. But really thinking through the role that faith communities have in building up an environment where violence has no part of our interpersonal relationships. So this is confronting work, and it does need broad social and cultural transformation if we're to address it. And all the evidence suggests that it is inequality between men and women, stereotypical and strong gender roles being adhered to, not being explored, not thinking through it in a nuanced way. And these are the drivers that we see from a services perspective. We see on the response end an increasing and quite dangerous set of human and social relationships. So these are two. I pull these two examples out, which are very, these are very much they'll be across Australia. They're very they're both on the rise. They're both complex, but they both speak into, if we can't get these elements right, how can we have a strong basis for a society where it's easier for people to be good to each other, let alone at a regional level, as I know that the Bridgetine Asylum Seeker Project with Bridget Arthur is represented here today, and we see the newly arrived and the people fleeing violence and how we treat treat them at a policy level, if not at a community level sometimes. So there is these aspects that we need to tidy up at home if we're to really contribute as a Australian group of people to this broader work of human security. So it is this holding carefully from a Catholic Social Services Victoria perspective, holding carefully our domestic concerns, Joe, as you mentioned, carefully and strongly, but seeing these as being very intimately linked in the way we orient ourselves to the world. And that's why a project to bring and a discussion around to bring a sense of personness and common good back into a public discourse is absolutely important if social services are going to be able to do good work into the future of building up a more just and compassionate society, which that's our aim, even if our contribution is just small down here in Victoria. So they're just a couple of comments of groundedness that I thought I'd bring to the discussion today. But many thanks to all at Pax Christi for putting this on today.
Thank you very much, Josh. And we're very pleased that you're able to make it and make a very important contribution, especially in relation to the two areas you've identified, homelessness and gender-based violence. Now, we were to have had also with us Tony Piccolo from the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, the AMWU, but unfortunately I don't see him, and unless he's hidden from view, I have to assume that he hasn't been able to join, and if so, we will have to call on him at a future date. But we do have one more organization that I'd like to call on, and that is the relatively recently formed Wesley Centre for Theology, Ethics and Public Policy, established by the Uniting Church to enhance understanding and debate on vital issues in Australian society. And we have with us this evening Dr. Daniel Sihombing, who is a fellow at the Centre, has a PhD in theology, is a candidate for Uniting Church Ministry, and has a very strong interest in liberation theology, militarism, and politics. So over to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Joseph. Good evening, everyone. As Joseph has mentioned, my name is Daniel Sihombing. I represent the Wesley Centre for Theology, Ethics and Public Policy as a fellow, and I'm also a candidate for ordination in the Uniting Church in Australia, the church tradition which grounds the work at the Wesley Centre. As we talk about human security with a view to a livable future, and to contrast that idea with military security, I remember the Uniting Church document in 2009 in response to, at the time, the financial crisis, which titled An Economy of Life. It was basically a critique of neoliberalism, but in connection to that economic system is the concerning growth of militarism and the global military spending. This is seen as the denial of love and human wholeness, which is claimed to be the vision offered by our Christian faith, the scriptures, and our tradition. The document especially points to one biblical verse, which is John 10, verse 10, where Jesus says, "I came that they may have life and have it abundantly." This vision of an abundant life of human wholeness is defined in the document as a vision of flourishing, abundant life, of peace and reconciliation, justice and transformation, love and inclusion for all creation. As for the current situation in Australia that is concerning in this regard is the prioritizing of military security over human security, as can be seen in the huge military budget spent for the building up of AUKUS coalition. The Uniting Church itself has responded to this with grave concerns last year in March 2023. Our president at that time, Reverend Sharon Hollis, also used the term security in her address. She said, "In the Uniting Church, we believe Jesus is our peace, and so we are committed to being a peacemaking community. True security and peace come from seeking to build relationships of trust and understanding, not through bigger military spending." So the building up of relationships of trust and understanding in opposition to militarism, that's one of the possible practical initiatives that's pointed out here. The other one is concerning the huge cost of the AUKUS submarines, which could have been used for other spending that would have given more priorities in the vision of human security, such as action for environment, education, health, social security, and welfare. So, in terms of key principles to our organization that animates our advocacy for this case, I would point out to Jesus' words about an abundant life, the vision of human wholeness, John 10:10. And for the practical initiatives, prioritizing the building up of relationships of trust and understanding, and prioritizing action for environment, education, health, social security, and welfare in our government spending instead of bigger military spending. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for connecting some of those issues to those, especially from the perspective of one's faith and how the two can be more effectively connected. Okay, now we don't have as much time as we would wish, but we have some time. I'd like to engage with all those who have contributed, Tim and the organizational reps that are with us. And I want to ask, you don't have to be all immediately answering this question, but those who choose to, as you've heard the range of issues raised, perspectives that have been shared with us, some priorities, what do you take from this kind of conversation on human security, and how much do you feel of that perspective clearly comes across in the current dominant narrative in the place we call Australia? So anyone of any, it's addressed to any any or all of our speakers this evening. Who would like to venture a thought?
Well, I'll say something, Joe.
Yes.
Just quickly. It would seem to me that some of the speakers have talked about the difference between human security and military security. And I think that's a very telling sort of thing to debate. And it seems here in Australia that the military security, whenever politicians or leaders are talking about security, it's normally about military security in terms of how safe Australia is. Whereas I think most of us tonight are talking about real security resting on how we look after each other, and particularly how we look after those most at risk.
Anyone else? Thank you, Bridget.
Sue's got her hand up, Joe.
Sorry, yes, please.
Okay. Hi, everybody, and thank you for all the contributions. And I think this notion of redefining, I mean, it's not a new notion to redefine security, but it's one that we really need to keep coming back to. And I particularly like the question that Aaron posed about, well, security for whom? Whose security are we talking about? And also drawing on Daniel Sihombing's comments just now about all and reflected in what most of the speakers have said about the if we look at the amount of good that could be done with the exorbitant eye-watering figures that are given to military projects, it just leaves one shaking one's head doesn't do it. But you know, $368 billion for submarines alone, and that cost will no doubt go up. And that's only part of the AUKUS project. I mean, there isn't any other government project, whether it's health or education or environment or climate or housing or anything, that comes close to getting that sort of sanctity that we afford to military budgets. And the government's approach, it was the same under Morrison, the same under this government. The government's approach is that we'll pay what it takes, and they say words more or less those exact words, whatever it takes, that's what we'll pay for security. So I think you'll get the picture. There's just no comparison in this notion that one area, one sector of our national life, i.e. the military, will be given whatever it takes, and every other sector will have to beg for what they need and make do with much less than what they need. Thanks.
Thanks, Sue. Open to any other contributions from our speakers? Anyone else?
Yeah.
Well,
yeah. So, Joe,
Tim.
Tim. I just think that we're trying to move the idea of the word security as applying to human security from the idea of military security. We do have a lot, certainly in Pearls, but even creeping into the mainstream media, of kickback against the arguments for spending a lot of money, wasting a lot of money on the kind of military type security from, you know, the left of the Labor Party, Paul Keating and co. So we get that, but I just think that those people are very eloquent about you know, kicking the idea of AUKUS, etc., down the road, but they're still locked into the military security idea largely, and it'd be good if we could see if we can kind of perhaps get them thinking. I don't know how to do this. I'm just an idea. Them thinking about the idea that it's not just military security that we, you know, that we're talking about. I suspect that a lot of them are kind of leaning that way in a sense, but are really going for broke against the idea of military security put forward by the right. They're just, yeah.
Tim, were you?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think this has been a terrific conversation. I think we have to face some difficult realities, that when we ask the people who are on our page about human security, they will resonate. However, the dominant story, you know, people in Australia and around the world live out of a pretty dominant story, is that security is fear of refugees, of the other, and that fear, and as we've seen this in the US election, is actually cutting through as the sharp definition of security, much more than what we have agreed on. And my sense is that we have to find a way of retelling our story, retelling it in much more cut-through ways, I'm in grief at the moment, as you've picked up from the US election. I'm trying to allow myself to grieve so it doesn't turn to despair. And despair actually cuts the nerve of acting. But that dominant story in the US and around other parts of the world really requires us to ask the question, how has not the appealing story of human security, as we have heard tonight, cut through? How do we reframe that, sharpen it, tell it differently, build people who actually will step up and say, that's what I mean by human security? That's the question I'm struggling with. I disagreed with nothing that was said tonight, but I am living with the sense that this argument isn't cutting through.
I wonder if I could follow up on what you've just said, Tim, and put it in the form of a question. One gets the impression, and correct me if you think it's a wrong impression, that there are thousands of people, whether they're paid staff or volunteers, working in hundreds of NGOs, each of which could be said to be making a bit of a contribution, could be in the aid and development sector, in the housing sector, in the health sector, any number, in the peace movement, etc., etc. But one gets the impression that they're so busy beavering away in their area, the specific area, and we can understand that because resources are often scarce, and you're working as energetically as you can to make headway into your particular area. My impression is that there's not enough attention paid while one works at one's particular area, be it any one of the things we've mentioned, refugees, etc. Not enough of the connections are made. And between these different aspects of humanity and the common good and human security, these larger concepts, how each bit fits into the jigsaw puzzle. And as Tim, you were saying just a minute ago, how to build together a story that is compelling and that people can respond to. And not only aren't the issues perhaps connected closely enough, assiduously enough, but the various people working on those different issues don't always have the opportunity to come together and share each one's experience. Is this the wrong impression? What do any of you who are active in your respective organization make of what I've just said? Not enough interchange, not enough connection between groups and between the issues on which these various groups are beavering away. Which is one of the underlying hopes that a human security project may be a drop in the bucket towards trying to develop that more compelling narrative that ties things together. Any thoughts, perspectives? Melissa?
Melissa, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joe. I remember the manifesto that Bertrand Russell and Alfred Einstein put out in 1955, which was calling upon people and nations to remember their humanity and forget the rest, to stop the cycle of confrontation and militarization and proliferation, and instead adopt a different approach. When I first came to work in this role just over a year ago, I saw that the only people talking about nuclear weapons really in the international arena were, it was happening only in the security and disarmament fora. And I thought immediately that that needed to be changed, that we need to connect this issue with everything else, because if there is a nuclear war, basically it will impact on every single other aspect of life, health, environment, human rights, food security, and so on. And so breaking down those silos and making those connections with other issues, I think is a hugely important way of trying to cut through with the message about human security, and showing that you're interested in other, how the planet is hurting, how people are hurting in every area of life, and to show those connections and to be there as part of a human family, lifting up the whole. So anyway, that's the kind of way we're thinking about, this approach to nuclear weapons, is connecting and showing that we're all connected. We're not separate from nature and each other, but we're a part of it. And that way we're helping to tackle a number of issues at the same time.
Anyone else would like to contribute? Can I raise another question to put to our speakers? One of the criticisms that has been made of the label, not the ideas, but of the label human security, is that it's not sufficiently alert to care of the earth, care of other forms of life, non-human, that it's too anthropocentric. No one has mentioned it this evening, but it has come up in some of our round tables, that though we are very much open to this idea of care of the earth and the environment, and therefore climate change and loss of biodiversity, maybe the word human security doesn't quite capture that, and maybe not enough of the wider environmental movement would be feel comfortable with that label. Any thoughts on that? No?
Well, it's a good point. I think we contend with this in social services quite a bit, Joyce, and I think it is worth being explicit about it. And I think what we've seen, as cascading crises kind of happen, whether it be a pandemic, a fires in across the floods, so the pulling together of human security is should include for sure the ramifications of living in completely unjust relationships with the world that sustains our human relationships. But it probably there's a byline I would suggest under there, because for me, yes, if you say human security, I think given the current reality, I think that from a social service perspective that we're seeing, it does make sense. But for others who are not seeing the everyday living of, say, the 300,000 people that our member organisations work to serve, I think it is important to put those two things together and make explicit those links. So yeah, I would encourage some kind of byline that does make that explicit, because of course we can say, to be secure as humans, our world needs our nature, whatever words, in this era of the Anthropocene, or however we talk about it, we have to bring some kind of attention to that. But also, I think, and this is recent discussions I've been having with friends who are engaged in environmental movements, is that we are at a point where we're at a point of not just getting on top of this changing world in terms of a climate and all kinds of things, but we're actually in a point where things are changing, and we must make definite movements to address those changes, as well as, of course, the more extreme changes that we might see into the future. So I think there is that. So I think that human security is not lost here, because it is actually about changing ourselves and our communities to relate to those new and indeed present with us changes that we're all trying to work through, which adds to this whole feeling of insecurity, and that can easily bring us into reified and streamlined communities that someone said tribalism before. We're at a point where there's distinct forces on us to become more tribal, but if we can move those to becoming more community and seeing those communities as linked, I think there's a bit of hope there and perhaps even a pathway forward.
Okay, well, I think we're getting very close to the point when we should close the conversation, but just if there is anyone else amongst our presenters who would like to share a parting reflection, please do so. Anybody?
Yeah, Peter Byrne here. I'd just like to comment that wearing another hat, I'm involved in a project to bring platypuses back to the Merri Creek. The reason being that platypuses don't exist in Merri Creek because the habitat is completely wrong for them. Platypuses are sort of the apex life form, if you like, in waterways. And until we fix completely the Merri Creek, which means removing all pollutants, bringing back all the life forms that the platypuses live on, the whole box and dice, we will never get anywhere. And I guess you can say that human beings are the apex people in the world, and unless we've got the complete ecosystem to support us, we'll never get anywhere. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, well, I think we've covered a lot of ground. I know that Tim Costello has been sharing with us his lament at events in the US. I suppose one of the lessons for us is might political developments in an election year in Australia next year lead us to better outcomes than perhaps we are seeing in the US at the moment. And that is perhaps a question that should concentrate the mind here in Australia. And just as a parting reflection on my part, wouldn't it be wonderful if come Australian budget, come an Australian election, and the federal budget will be announced obviously prior to an election, or we think very likely prior to the election, if various groups, few of which were represented in tonight's conversation, were able to respond to those major developments, national, with some kind of common perspective underpinning the particular areas in which they want to make their voices heard. I've always felt that a budget a federal budget, which affects so many lives in so many different ways, expresses the official statement of national priorities, and whether that corresponds with a human security agenda. That's one test. And of course, an election or some major other development that is, including, for instance, recently the voice referendum, there are occasions when it would be useful for a compelling human security narrative, whatever one calls it, to be able to be conveyed rather than just the point of view of this group, that group, and then the other group independently and separately from each other. But that's just a thought, perhaps worth exploring as we come closer to a budget and a referendum and a budget in what will be trying global economic circumstances. Okay, well, let me take this opportunity to thank everyone, to thank our speakers, Tim, for his insightful introduction to the threat to which human security is, the threats to which human security is currently exposed, and for the various insights and contributions that our other representatives from different organizations have been making in the course of this evening, with, to my understanding, a great deal of common ground and shared perspectives. So thank you all, and thank you to Katrina for starting us off this evening, and to all those who have contributed to the success of the project, and to all those who have attended and very silently have been listening. But we are taking notice of what has been said in the chat box, and we will have many other opportunities in the coming months and certainly next year to engage with people in more extensive and interactive fashion than we have done today. So thank you. There is much on the table by way of ideas as to how to proceed and what to do. And we very much look forward to remaining in touch with all the groups and all those individually who have joined us in the course of this year and tonight. So thanks again, and look forward to engaging in the near future again. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye.